So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from. Welcome to today's edition of Shaping EDU Live. Today is a really special edition for many reasons. Chief among those reasons is it is actually going to be hosted and led by someone other than me. Gasp, shock, I know, it's true. We are so fortunate enough to have us to have Ruben Pointadora joining us today. Founder of Hippasis and also Shaping EDU Mayor of Promoting Access and Equity. And in just a little bit, we're going to dive into our main program. But before we do, I just want to acquaint you to a couple things about this lovely virtual room that we're in. If you are new to the whole Zoom experience, I want to let you know that on the black bar at the bottom, you could click chat, which will open up a box and get you in a situation where you can be messaging with everyone else in this event. Additionally, many of you are already in the Shaping EDU Slack workspace, which is great. Conversations are going to continue there after this event, but also conversations there continue year-round. So if you're not yet in the space and you've registered for this event, you will have gotten an invitation to join that space. So that's what that's all about. It's just a way for us to be able to have conversations and connect with each other year-round. Another thing I want to orient you to is the mute button. This is going to be in our program, but we understand that during the course of the hour, you may be interrupted by colleagues. There may be a stray cat and lots of noise happening. We ask you to keep yourselves on mute unless you're speaking so that we can avoid any kind of ambient noises that may distract from the program. And if you can't mute yourselves, I will mute you with much love. If you have any questions during today's program for Ruben or for anyone else, you are welcome and encouraged to type those questions into the chat, and we will try to get to them. But of course, there's also the raise your hand function if you have a burning question that you just need addressed immediately. Yes, Tom is illustrating what it looks like to be on fire with a inquiry. Love it. And then finally, because several different modalities just isn't enough, we are also on Twitter. Our handle is Shaping EDU, and our hashtag is Shaping EDU. So we're trying to make it as convenient for you as possible to tweet and start back channel conversations there. And yes, as you can probably tell, this event is being recorded, and you will be able to share and view the recording a few days after this live event. So those are sort of all the logistical items. And now let me give you a little bit of context about this program, especially if this is your first foray with Shaping EDU and you happen to get an email that said Ruben Pointadora would be presenting and you thought, hey, this is a great time to make this my first trip to Shaping EDU. So Shaping EDU is a community of dreamers, doers, and drivers who are shaping the future of learning in the digital age. So these are change makers at every level of the education system, from students to faculty, to designers, to technologists, to vendors, to consultants, to everyone in between, NGOs, GOs. Shaping EDU was really founded with the philosophy that it really doesn't matter what role you're in. We acknowledge that everyone in working around and in learning brings a unique skill set and perspective to conversations. And so we value individuals over affiliations. And it's all about how we can bring our different perspectives and experiences together to create and act on an actionable agenda for learning in the digital age. And what does that mean? Well, we have our 10 actions to shape the future of education. Those 10 actions can be found on our website, shapingedu.asu.edu. And I mentioned earlier that Ruben is the mayor of Promoting Access and Equity. All of our actions are situated in different neighborhoods in our virtual space. And so when we think about shaping the future of learning in the digital age, we're thinking about promoting access and equity, and we're thinking about our other 10 actions, which include humanizing learning, innovating applications of artificial intelligence, connecting education to the workforce of the future, et cetera, et cetera. But when we get together and we talk about those actions, we know there's certain things about education and the society at large that we just can't anticipate. And that really sort of is the impetus for why we're all gathered here today to talk about black swans and dragon kings. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off to my lovely co-host, Ruben Pointadora, to give you an intro into what you can expect from today's program and to dive right into Black Swan Lake. Take it away, Ruben.
All right. Thank you, Sam, so much. Well, welcome, everybody. It's really great to be here. And first, what I wanted to do was set out something right from the beginning. This is meant to be a session for people to learn, to talk. So please use the chat freely. Please, as you're going to see, we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to have some fun with the topic. So I'm hoping that this is going to be an opportunity for people to get to know each other a bit more as they're also finding out some things about black swans, dragon kings, what they are in the first place, and why we care about them. So let's start up by getting a few ideas on the table. All right, I'm going to put up some slides here, but again, as we're going through, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions, to make comments. There we go. So now you should see on screen the first slide. So let's start talking about the first of our critters for this morning, and that's the black swan. And one of the things about black swans is they are a remarkable animal. They completely transformed the knowledge of the world when people from Europe who thought that all swans were white suddenly found that in Australia that was not the case, hence the name of the black swan. And the term refers to any event that has these three properties. It cannot be predicted ahead of time, number one. So anybody that tells you, okay, so what we're going to be doing is predicting black swans, something's wrong. You cannot predict a black swan event. A black swan event is an event that cannot be predicted ahead of time. Number two, it has a major effect. We're not talking in black swan events about things that, oh, that's nice, did anybody know this? We're talking about things that really make a big change. The type of things that make a huge change moving forward. You say, wow, things were not the same after the black swan event that they were before. The type of things that really transform everything from how we act in the world to how we look at the world to how things happen in that world. So these are events that really change things. And the last thing about black swans is that they can be rationalized retroactively. So once the event happens, everybody says, oh, of course, we should have seen it coming because of X, Y, and Z, except of course, you never do. And that's important to realize. Again, you always have to think of that first one. A black swan event cannot be predicted ahead of time, even though after it's happened, we can figure out, well, why did it come to be? Why did it come about? So, okay, so that's the description of black swan event. This is a term that was created by Nicola Talbot. And one of the questions then is, so will be an example? Well, now here's an example on screen. If you look at several of the famous economic crises of the 20th century, and then the 21st, of course, in 2008, you'll find that they very much have this characteristic of black swanhood, if you will. In other words, they were not predictable ahead of time. Yes, people knew something was happening in the markets, but the actual shape, what was happening, how it was going to happen, what the impact was, those remain pretty much opaque to most people. And additionally, they had a huge impact. Each and every one of these had a major impact on the economic system, on laws, on what people expected the economy to behave like, how and why, and so on. And again, retrospectively, people could say, for instance, oh yes, let's talk about 2008, for instance. Well, we know that there were these problems with, for instance, packaging together of junk bonds in such a way that it was not clearly visible what they were. And that led to a certain type of assumption that they would behave independently, but they didn't behave independently. They coupled to each other, and that crashed the market. And certain things about the housing market. In other words, you can read about all of this. Lewis and other people have written some great books about it. But the bottom line is all of this is retrospective. we're figuring out what happened after it happened. So black swan events have this characteristic. All right, so what do? If we can't predict a black swan event, if we can't say ahead of time, this is coming down the line, what can we do instead? Well, one of the things that we can do instead is we can say, well, let's create scenarios for black swans. And this is an example of a project that was done at Brookings for the second presidency of President Barack Obama. And it was a presidential book with both big bets and black swans. Now, the big bets were opportunities, but the black swans were all scenarios that took the form of saying, well, suppose this foreign policy event happens, or this is a major area of instability in international relations, or this is something that's likely to change, etc. What could you do? But remember, these are black swans. These weren't guidelines for how to negotiate, say, in the Middle East, for instance. Rather, it was along the lines of saying, here is what the black swan event would look like in the Middle East. And here's how you would go about dealing with it and so on, but not because it was a prediction of that event, rather because it was intended to create a scenario for exploration by the cabinet of thinking about, okay, how do we look at the general family of events, the class of events? How do we look at the landscape where these things or things like these could come out of the brush anytime, except that it's not going to be these, because these we could have predicted, but it would be things that are adjacent to them. So that's one thing we can do with black swan events. We can't predict them, but we can create scenarios for them, and using the scenarios to think about them, we can say, well, okay, where could these events come up, and what would be the general type of approach that we'd have to have ready were such an event to occur. That's one way of doing this. However, there's other ways of dealing with this, and we'll come back to this later today, because we're actually not going to just be listening to me talk here. You're going to be engaging in an exercise that's going to be designed to help you think about, deal with black swan type events. But before we do more with black swans, I want to talk about their cousins, because it's not all black swans. One of the things about black swans is some people get very pessimistic when you talk about black swans. They say, well, listen, if we can't predict them, if they can come out of anywhere, yes, I know you're telling us we can look at the landscape and so on, but is it all just random? Do we have no hope? And I say, well, hold on. There are other types of events that are cousins to the black swans, sort of, as we're going to see, that have a bit more predictability to them. And one of the types of events that has this characteristic are what are called Dragon Kings. Now, before we get to Dragon Kings, we have to look at a different type of event that is actually statistically predictable, and those are power law type events. You're very familiar with power law type events. For instance, as you can see in the plot on the left of this slide, earthquakes follow this type of power law predictability. I can't tell you when the next big earthquake is going to hit, but I can say, well, small earthquakes are 10 times more frequent than somewhat bigger earthquakes, which in turn are 10 times more frequent than even bigger earthquakes, which in turn are 10 times more bigger than the big one, etc. So what I can do with this is I can say, I can't predict when the next big earthquake is going to hit, but I can say what the overall statistical distribution of earthquakes is going to be. And that means, among other things, I can sell you an insurance policy. Why? Because I can say, well, I can build this building so it'll survive the smallest of the earthquakes, the next one, and so on. But I'll only worry about the really big one if I need a building that has to be able to survive that once in 100 years type earthquake. I don't know exactly when it's going to hit, but I know that as a matter of just the statistical distribution, this power law type distribution, there is going to be such an earthquake. And this is also the case where other things, floods, for instance, tend to follow this type of pattern. There are many things that follow this. So in these cases, while we can't predict exactly when an event is going to occur, we can, however, predict the overall distribution of events, which brings us to our friends, the Dragon Kings. because this would be all fine and good, except that sometimes we see what you see in the diagram here on the right-hand side of the slide. We have a nice power law distribution, and suddenly, somewhere towards the tail end where you should see the fewest of these events happening, boom, you get a spike. And these spikes are called Dragon Kings. The term was coined by Sonnet, who basically said, well, look, these are events that share something with the other events along that power law distribution, but at the same time, there's something that drives them more, that drives them forward, that pushes them to the foreground. So Dragon Kings are not predictable in the sense that the power law is. In other words, they are a deviation from that power law, and I can't say when that deviation is going to occur, but the good news is they are somewhat more predictable than black swans. Unlike black swans, which come out of the blue and you can't predict at all, Dragon Kings, you can say, well, okay, they're going to be in certain classes. There are certain signs you can follow. This would take us into the math of Dragon Kings, which is not where I want to go today. I just want to show it to you as an example of, if you will, the other end of this unpredictability range. Now, I could give you another example from the financial markets, but sadly, as it happens, we have an example that's fresh from the news that I was working on last week, and that's Venice. If you've been following the news from Venice, you'll notice that there's been some major flooding events. And one of the questions you could ask is, well, are we looking at the standard distribution of flooding events in Venice? Is this just a power law phenomenon? And well, it's just a bad luck of the draw that we got this event? Well, what I'm showing you on screen is 100 years of the Agua Alta, these high water events in Venice. And you can see that it follows indeed what looks very much like some type of power law or close to that type distribution. Okay, what you're seeing is how many Agua Alta events are, how many days of Agua Alta are present in any given year, and you can see this distribution. Most years have no Agua Alta events, then a smaller number of years has one Agua Alta event, then an even smaller number has two Agua Alta, all the way up to 6 Agua Alta events. And that was the situation for about 100 years. But you know what's going to come in the next slide. If instead of just looking at those 100 years, we look up to this year, we now get this diagram. And in this diagram, you can see things don't look so nice anymore. Because now we don't have that nice smooth distribution. We have, in fact, some elements of this fat tail, if you will, that's associated with Dragon King type events. In other words, part of what we're looking at here seems to be a scenario where what's happening, what we're thinking about, etc., seems, I don't want to make any big claims here. Please understand, I've only spent a few days with this data set, because sadly the floods have only happened in the last week or so. But it does look like we're looking at exactly this type of phenomenon, where we have an underlying set of well-defined statistical range for floods, and then recent items have helped create this spike. It hasn't, you notice that what seems to be happening is it doesn't seem to be changing the statistical distribution as much as it seems to be driving these Dragon King type events of unusually high water events occurring. So what we have here are the two ends. We have at one end the black swans, and at the other end, this unpredictability range, we have the Dragon King. So there's a whole range of other possibilities, other options in the middle. We'll pause the share here for 1 second. So at this point, I've introduced the Swan Kings, sorry, the Black Swans, that was good. The Black Swans. I've also introduced the Dragon Kings. Any questions that people would like to ask in the chat space before we move on to our next question, which is, why do we care about all of this? All right. That was Sonette that they coined the Dragon King term. And Tom asked a great question. Are black swans always bad? No. And that's a very, very important point. So thank you, Tom, for asking that. The black swan generally, yes, is perceived as bad because it comes, it surprises you, and 9 times out of 10, it's not what you wanted to have happen. But here's one of the interesting things. If you have the dragon, the black swan landscape, if you will, in mind, and you have available to you the type of thinking or how you deal with it, it is in fact possible. Sorry, I'm just typing in the chat space here. It is possible, in fact, to turn black swan events to your advantage. So this gets into some more complex issues, such as, okay, so how do you create the scenario or the situation where black swan events are to your advantage? And that would take us further afield than we can go today. But it is, in fact, possible for a black swan event to not be a negative event, but instead to be a positive event. And for instance, a simple example would be some of the discoveries that have come about in medical fields. Okay, the discovery of antibiotics, for instance, is that type of event. It has a positive effect. It's also, to some extent, a black swan event that was being sought, but the transformation of the medical field that it brought about went well beyond what had been predicted by people who were researching the field. So it is possible to have a positive black swan event, but you do have to be, once again, prepared for how to profit, if you will, or how to take advantage from that black swan event in most scenarios. And I see Deborah's asking, can I elaborate more on black swan thinking? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, we're going to do an exercise with black swan thinking. So one of the ways of doing black swan thinking is to say, let's come up with scenarios that don't respond to what we would like to have happen. Let's look at scenarios that don't look like, well, at my college, university, school, whatever, this is what I would like to see happen in terms of student enrollment or in terms of how I'd like to see my endowment grow, whatever it is. Let's start thinking about the negative side of that. Let's start looking at the question of how or why it is the case that something completely unexpected would happen. Now remember, this is unexpected, I can't predict it, but I have to start working through scenarios that are negative scenarios. I have to start working through scenarios that say, what happens if what I want to have happen fails? What would be the opposite? What would I have to do if I deliberately wanted to make something bad happen? So this is where you start getting into black swan thinking. Another aspect of black swan thinking is in terms of looking at the whole landscape, saying, how can I profit from the downside, even if it comes? So how do I set up things so that instead of losing more than I gain from any one of these particular swings, I invert that relationship? And that gets us into a whole domain of thinking about what's called anti-fragility and how to design for it. So these are the types of thinking that you want to do. As I say, we're going to do an exercise at the end of the session today where you're going to see a little bit of this black swan thinking in action. All right? And for people who wanted it, oh, thank you, Sam, for having put the link to DDS.net as well in the chat box. All right? Okay, so now let's go on where we're going to talk just a little bit more about why this matters. Because again, you could take the pessimistic approach of saying, well, it's just going to happen and I can't do anything about it. But remember, we also said that there's a range here. It's not just all black swan, I can't help it, I can't do anything about it. It also includes the Dragon King, where maybe I can do some things to both either help predict or at least help handle some of the worst effects or change some things so they go for positive effects for me instead of negative effects for me. So let me get back to my slides now. and show you a little bit of that. All right, so let's think for a second about what's happening right now with AI in the world. All right, so here we go. Artificial intelligence is not replacing jobs as much as it is tasks. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because it sounds good at first. It sounds like, oh, okay, great. So people aren't going to be losing their jobs. They're just going to have tasks changed or tasks modified by artificial intelligence. And if you look at this chart, you can see that, in fact, where we're talking about that jobs at risk of significant change, you can see it's a sizable fraction, no matter which country, for the ones for which we have data, this is from the OECD, you're looking at. So far, so good. But the question is, okay, so great. So we just need to worry about how to deal with that task modification and nothing else happens, right? Not quite. And this is another example for why you want to be thinking about black swans and dragon kings in the context of what students are learning, what the students can do, what their job landscape looks like. Suppose you have three tasks. Right now, three jobs, A, B, and C. From the outside, they look monolithic. But if you look at them, they're all chopped up into smaller individual tasks. Now, if I'm looking at somebody who's working job A, I might say, well, they have a certain overlap in some tasks with job B and a much smaller overlap in tasks with job C. Which means that if we're looking at job A communicating with jobs B and C, or the person that's carrying out job A being able to transfer into job B or to job C, well, it's harder for them to transfer into job C than it is to transfer into job B because of the smaller overlap in the number of tasks. Okay, the vertical dimension here is telling me how much tasks overlap. But now bring artificial intelligence into the picture. All right, and now artificial intelligence can automate some of the tasks, but not others. And here's the thing. If now two of those tasks were automated in A, one in B, and none in C, then suddenly the connections between job A, job B, and C are much weaker than they were before. And that means that suddenly the person that was working job A cannot easily transfer to jobs B or C, or for that matter, that the communication, the connections between these jobs are weaker, more complex, more difficult to tease out than they were before. And this is a scenario that doesn't just mean that we need to think about AI. It's a scenario that also means that we need to think about how to work in a landscape where the landscape of jobs is more likely to show black swans and dragon kings. Because what I've just shown you here with tasks and jobs is known to be exactly the type of scenario that tends to create scenarios like black swans, like dragon kings. In other words, we're not just looking at a case where we're saying, well, the person X has this task done by AI, therefore they can just now learn task B or C, or they just need to learn how to deal with the AI. All those things are true, don't get me wrong. But in addition to that, we're looking at a landscape for the world our students will be entering, for the world they'll be living in, where the very landscape of the jobs they carry out, how they carry them out, how they're connected with each other, are much more likely to be a nesting ground, if you will, for black swans and dragon kings. And in this context, I very much like this statement from Next that talks about what do they want graduates from Japanese universities to have. And I'm going to apologize for my horrendous Japanese pronunciation to begin with, but this idea of kakushioku. So the ability required for university graduates for an unpredictable era, including the education, knowledge, and experience to make correct decisions in the face of unexpected difficulties. And that's what we're looking at in these black swan type scenarios, all right? So at this point, I've given you, hopefully, in addition to a little bit of a context for what a Black Swan event is and what a Dragon King event is, a little bit more of an understanding for why, not just in a general sense, but in a very specific sense, with AI modifying the world we're living in, but particularly the world of the workplace, why it becomes crucial for us to start thinking about how we build in aspects of Black Swan thinking into how we work with students, into what we do with them, and how we do it, right? So again, let me stop sharing here for a second and bring back the chat space. All right, so again, any questions or comments? Because the last thing we're going to do now is we're going to shift to a small exercise where we're going to be working on Black Swan thinking. But any questions? Any comments?
So
yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to share. I see Thomas has a late entry. Could you relate Black Swans to paradigm shifts?
The answer is yes, but it gets complicated. Part of the reason is that Kuhn himself was rethinking the whole idea of a paradigm shift. So it's a great question, but we'd have to get into rethinking first what the paradigm shift is. So the short answer would be yes. In many cases, when you look at what's going on with Black Swans, when you look at something like, for instance, Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism and how it doesn't just change, okay, how do we work on electromagnetic problems, but it actually changes how you think about a whole class of problems. You are looking at a Black Swan type event. But again, as I said, Kuhn was rethinking at the time of his death the whole idea of paradigm shifts. So we have to get a little bit more into a discussion of why he was doing that and how to connect to Black Swans. Great topic, though. I'd love to do another session another day on that. It really is worthwhile. All right. So what we're going to do now for the last portion of this session is we're going to be looking at thinking a little bit about Black Swans and Dragon Kings. And to do that, we're going to get our hands dirty with an exercise. And the exercise is the following. Yes, Sam is rubbing her hands, I can see.
I'm ready.
Remember what I said a minute ago about, well, you need to think in a sort of negative sense rather than a positive sense? Well, that's what you're going to be doing right now. Because I'm going to ask you to think about the following. Lots of different networks tie together events, items, etc., that hold an academic institution together. The people, the students, faculty, etc., objects such as labs, libraries, and so on, and also organizational elements, such as, for instance, well, what? Well, the books we assign for courses and how they're connected to each other. And right now, there's an amazing project, which is the Open Syllabus Project, which is working on the collecting this information. What the courses are that are being taught, what books they're using, and for instance, which books are being shared among courses. So let me put that on screen so you can see that. Right, so. So you should now see a screen. This is in my browser. And this is the Open Syllabus Corpus. And what I'm showing you here is books that are assigned, and they're close to other books that are assigned in the same courses or are co-assigned. So I'm going to zoom in here for a second, just so you can see what's going on. For instance, here is writing, and oh, here's dear William Strunk. And if I click on William Strunk, okay, sorry, I lost that for a second. No. You'll notice I get a little window here that says Elements of Style, William Strunk, and then it says View Profile. And when I click on View Profile, I get this window over here. And this window tells me, well, courses in what areas have assigned Elements of Style. And the other thing is which books have been co-assigned with it. So for instance, I can see that I have here on Writing Well, an informal guide to writing nonfiction, a manual for writers of term papers, theses, and dissertations, the visual display of quantitative information. Interesting. The first two are clearly related to writing courses, but the third one seems to be related to how you display information. Okay. Well, what I'm telling you now is this resource tells you something very important about one of the networks that underlies what we do in academia. Because what this resource does is it says if you're co-teaching two books, you're establishing connections among them. You're establishing linkages. And these linkages are important in terms of holding the fabric of academic institutions together. So in fact, when you're doing that, you could say, well, okay, if I co-teach this book with this other book, maybe I could bring two areas together. Or maybe I don't want to bring those two areas together. So maybe I don't want to co-teach these two books, so I want to separate them apart. Now, normally your inclination would be to think about this in the way of saying, okay, how do I preserve things the way they are? But I'm going to ask you to do something different. I'm going to switch now to my slides for the last bit before we break out into a discussion session. And I'm going to put your task on screen. Because your task is going to be this. You are now Maxwell's silver-hammered demons. Your attempts to overturn the second law of thermodynamics have been repeatedly foiled by the academic community. So you've decided to bring the whole edifice of academia crashing down by creating conditions that will bring about the Black Swan or Dragon King event. And you decide to begin by destabilizing the network of scholarship that is embodied in the co-assignment of texts in college courses. Which text do you delete, add, separate, bring together, and why? And of course, you've got a link to the map I was just showing. So what we're going to do now, for those of you who would like to play, if you will, in this playground, is break out into a few rooms. And let's see, I'm going to say 2 rooms, Sam, or do you want to just keep everybody? Well, we keep everybody here. It's a small enough group, I think we can do that.
Whatever you want. We can do 2, we can do 1. It's totally up to you.
Let's keep it in 1. Normally, I would break it out into smaller groups, but I want to make sure that there's some lag in switching back and forth. So let's just keep everybody in the room.
Okay.
So here's what I would like to invite people to do. You've got the resource, okay? And it's, again, what I'll do is I'll paste this into the chat space just so everybody has it handy. Okay. So there you go. That's the resource. So what I'd like you to do is to start proposing. Take a look at this. Discuss. How would you break apart academia by taking out some of these texts? Now, don't take out Strunk and White. Strunk and White is too obvious. Strunk and White, everybody uses. Look for linkages. Look for the places where you say, well, gee, this seems to bring together things that I would otherwise see as apart. Well, do I want to get rid of that connection instead? So not necessarily the big one, but the one that somehow links things together. Or maybe you can make things too rigid. Do you want to add some connections that are not there? Think about this. But this is the type of thinking that's involved in Black Swan thinking. You don't want to be thinking about how do I preserve what I've already got. Okay? If you think about how do I preserve what I've already got, you wind up repeating the same solutions you've got before, and you're going to completely miss Black Swan type events. This is where you're thinking negatively. What type of omission would help bring the edifice down? What type of changes here? If you don't like textbooks, well, maybe would knocking out a textbook or 2 bring the whole edifice down or help bring it down? I mean, you can't create the event itself. Remember, you're just creating the conditions for a Black Swan event. But will you do it? Would perhaps going with all individualized or personalized texts go, with assigning everybody the same text to it? I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to let you use the chat space And okay, so I'm looking here. Brian, what's break apart mean? So for instance, suppose I have two areas, which is economics and one which is, uh, say, English brought together by a textbook. Then if I eliminate a text that's being co-taught, I've broken apart, I've separated out two nodes in the network.
I'm kind of piggybacking on Paul's comment here a little bit, but also it was the immediate thing I thought of because I've been struggling with this myself as I've been working on my own writing projects. But, you know, the thing about Strunk and White is that citations are an edifice of power in the system. And they're also an increasingly archaic system of power because they're built around paper. And increasingly our communications, our idea transmission is not done on dead trees. It still is, but it's definitely the balance has shifted in the last 30 years. I think everyone would agree with that. So to me, I think Strunk and White is actually one way because it has a ripple effect through everything else because it legitimizes certain sources which are currently delegitimized in the system. And they will then, within various disciplines, create, shall we say, black swan effects as a ripple effect across the system. So I know you said we can't use Strunk and White, but I mean, I have trouble figuring out something else that is as easy and simple. So we publish an alternative to Strunk and White for the digital age.
Sounds good. Okay, and that's fair enough. And again, the point is, keep thinking about ways that would disrupt the system, right? And that's why I gave you the link so that you can actually play with the website a little bit. So try opening up a browser window and look around a little bit. See if you spot any text, anything that looks suspiciously interesting in terms of what you might do.
So I do actually have a question about this. How are the relationships determined among the subjects? I mean, the geolocation of the different nodes, so to speak.
Right, good question. The location is given by how close one is to the other, is how many are co-taught using books from that area to the other.
How much overlap there is of citations.
Correct, yes. So, and this is the courses that are, the texts that are assigned in the course.
And if nothing else, this graphic has made my day. So you've succeeded on that at least.
Wonderful. So other people, anybody finding, try typing into the search box a couple of your favorite books and see what they're doing. So how much, Brian, how much power you have? You're a demon. Feel free to go into the library and steal all the copies of a book or replace all of one book with another. Can you alter software? In this case, I wasn't planning on that in this scenario. This is very much a traditional book scenario. I see, yes, messing with word or Grammarly. That's a great exercise, but that's a different one for a different era. So take a look, for instance, let me give you a hint here. Take a look, for instance, if you're looking in areas such as education, okay? Suppose you're trying to think about how you do that. Take a look at some of the books. So for instance, I'm looking here at Robert Marzano's Classroom Instruction That Works. Okay. And the interesting thing is, if you look quickly through the list of books that are associated with it or co-taught with it, you'll find plenty of books on pedagogy, you'll find plenty of books on technology and so on. But you're not going to find a lot in terms of connection to different areas. So you're not going to find much, say, that connects it to sciences, for instance. You're not going to find much that connects it to engineering, or, you know, so that starts to open up some interesting possibilities. in terms of what we can do. Brian, can you only remove that? No, you can assign text. You could add a text to the list, absolutely. Or you could say, this is the text, but it's not being coded out with this one. I now mandate that it be coded out with these other ones. Okay, so Deborah, how about eliminating critical thinking skills by Stella Cottrell? Now we're getting something interesting. Exactly. So let's see. Let me go to Cottrell's book. Excellent idea. Okay.
Hey, Ruben, can you share your screen real quick while you're doing that?
Sure. Let me.
I'm just having trouble finding it as fast as you are.
No, the problem. Give me 1 sec. I wish Zoom allowed me to do a split screen on this, but that's okay. There we go. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, so here we go. I did a search on Cottrell, and here's Critical Thinking Skills by Stella Cottrell. And there it is. It's showing up smack dab in the middle in between research methods, statistics, and business, interestingly enough, in its landscape. Psychology, social work are also in the neighborhood. Let's see if we look at the view profile on critical thinking skills. What do we get? So we get that it's primarily co-taught with English Lit, business, nursing, education, fitness and leisure, basic skills, computer science, architecture, sociology, and media and communications. And here's the list of books that are co-taught with it. So I think that's an excellent, congratulations. I think you've done a great job of taking a nice shot at something that's liable to produce a Black Swan event, because that book is doing a great job, if you know this. Look through the list. You've got a very nice mix here. You've got social sciences research, you've got literature, you've got pedagogy, right? And if we go back up to the top of the list, even though we're not seeing them, we know computer science is showing up there. So this looks like a primary example of a text that if you took it out, you'd actually do some very nice setup, if you will, of areas that used to be connected suddenly starting to fall apart. So you've got a nice setup there for a Black Swan event. Very, very nice choice. Any other suggestions? Let's see. So let's see. Yeah, Tom, sorry. Design Unbound doesn't seem to have made it yet onto anybody's lists. From Jen, I'm looking here. Okay. So looking at math, can we consolidate or eliminate many of the math books? Absolutely. Again, you're allowed to do it. And again, keep thinking. Because sometimes the temptation to consolidation says, wow, you know, we have all these books, we just go with one, but you might be losing nuance, you might be losing connections, and hence, again, allowing this type of falling apart Black Swan, Dragon King event that might otherwise happen. Brian, you've got assign a very liberal or conservative text. Any suggestions? Oh, okay, I see you've got there, let's remove the Communist Manifesto. Okay, let me go into sharing mode again and see what we can do there. So let's do Marx and remove the Communist Manifesto. Okay. There we go. One of the most assigned texts, the Communist Manifesto. There it is. And we see that it's in the heart of sociology with neighbors anthropology, writing, media studies, gender studies, with further afield, political theory and philosophy. Let's look at the profile. Very interesting, because what we're seeing with eliminate the manifesto is, notice what the first few texts are. It's being co-taught with the Second Treatise of Government by Locke, Leviathan by Hobbes, the Social Contract by Rousseau, On Liberty by Mills. In other words, what it's doing, if you eliminate that, one of the things you're going to be doing is eliminating a junction between what are you might view as conservative texts and what you might view as liberal or left-wing texts. So something very interesting could indeed happen there. I notice also if we scroll down, we're going to see text in philosophy. So here's Republic, we've got sociology with Weber. So again, some very interesting things would happen there, where by choosing that particular text to take out, you would be, in fact, breaking up some interesting connections. Any other proposals? So thank you, Brian. I think that's another interesting one. So from Laura here, if we break key ties between areas or force ties between fields, we could achieve our mischievous goals. Exactly right. In other words, this is what I mean by this is black swan thinking. Because when you think about assigning a book for a course, or you think about assigning a book for a department, I've participated, I'm sure many other people in this session have too, in discussion groups where we say, well, we'd like all the incoming first-year students to read book X or to read book Y and so on. The main focus is typically on why we want that book, but not necessarily on the connections that that book would either make or break to other areas. And one of the things that we're looking at here is the question of how our play, how our mischievous demon here can actually start wreaking quite a bit of havoc just by saying, well, which books that form a network can we choose to either break apart portions of the network or bring together portions of the network that we couldn't otherwise. Now, if we were doing this as a more formal session, here's where I might break out the tools of social network analysis, and I'd say, okay, let's get some numbers here, and let's see what Brian's destruction of the manifesto has done, and see what the impact is and how it would destabilize. But this is the last thing I wanted to leave you with. One of the reasons I wanted to do this as a free-form exercise, as something that participants would be looking at without saying, okay, what's the mathematical impact of book Y versus book X, is because you need to be thinking about this. And the type of thinking that's involved is quite different from the type of thinking that's involved when you're saying, well, let me see how I shore up what I've done all along in the same way I've done all along. This starts to get you out of that pattern. This is what I mean by black swan thinking. When you're trying to think as so I'm the demon, that's going to bring about this black swan event. What do I do? How do I trip it up? And once you start looking at this, even if you're not taking out the book, you start looking at the connections between courses in different ways. And that can get you looking at things different. And this is where I wanted to close on today, because one of the things that we know right now is we're seeing a severe drop in enrollment in the humanities. This is actually a serious problem. It's a question of what happens with the humanities moving forward. Are they viable? Do we need to be looking at rethinking this and so on? But many of the approaches I've seen proposed or discussed are more of what we've done in the past. And I'm not convinced that that's necessarily what's called for here, but rather the type of thinking that's involved in terms of black swan thinking, in terms of Dragon King thinking, and how to move it forward. So this is the first exercise. Take it home, play with it, call up some of your friends, say, hey, how would you like to get together over the weekend and figure out how we destroy academe by taking out books or adding books to the list? It's a first step. And it's where I wanted to get you to in terms of how you might think about thinking about black swan thinking. One of the things that Samantha, Laura, and I have discussed is doing some additional exercises in this series. And now that we've used today to set the groundwork, the next few are going to be a bit more serious and a bit more in-depth. And we're going to be able to look at other approaches, other ways of doing black swan thinking, other ways of thinking about what might happen, how we can, if we can't predict the black swans, we can at least be ready for them. And maybe, just maybe, instead of just being at their mercy, be able to profit from them, be able to revive, revitalize, generate new areas in what we do in colleges, universities, and schools. So we're pretty much at the end of our time here. Any questions, any last comments, etc.? So from Deborah, absolutely. We're going, don't worry, your wish will be satisfied. We will be doing more of these. We will be having more fun of these. I'll give you a little hint on the next one. The next one is going to be a card game. a very special card game. A card game where you're going to be at once working in two directions, constructing and destructing, and again, getting a little bit of a feel for what Black Swan events might look like in academia. But we'll come back to that one next time. All right. Any final questions or comments? Sam, Laura, anything I've missed in the chat space that you've spotted?
No, I just want to thank you so much, Ruben, for sharing your time, your insights, and really starting off our Wednesday mornings right. I think this is a great diving off point, pun intended, for further discussions and activities around this subject. And so I'm really excited to share from a Shaping EDU Live perspective that we certainly have you back. We'll certainly have Ruben back for part 2, hopefully part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6, because this is an evolving live thing. Thank you so much. You've been a fabulous audience. The recording will be posted to the Shaping EDU YouTube channel as well as our website. And the recording will be shared out with all registrants, and you're welcome to share it with all. Thank you so much for choosing to spend an hour of your time this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you're tuning in from, with us at Shaping EDU Live today. And until next time, keep dreaming, doing, and driving. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.